Hi, this video is going to talk about the story of Noah's flood as an example of one of the challenges and the great opportunities that we face as readers of the Old Testament. My promise is that we are going to investigate the idea of thinking mythically or thinking mythologically when we read some of these very, very ancient Old Testament texts. We have the documentary hypothesis, something that we've discussed in this year's version of our class, that tells us that there's more than one source for some of the big stories that we tell in the Old Testament. So, for instance, the creation story in the first two chapters of Genesis is told in two different versions, right? The story of Noah's flood also seems to have two versions that are not told in neat separate chunks, but they seem to be just woven together in a kind of perplexing way. And so if you look at Genesis 7 and Genesis 8, you'll see that the story of Noah has conflicting details. In some spots, the Bible tells us that that the flood was 40 days and 40 nights, with great mythical number, right? The Israelites wandered in the desert 40 days, 40 nights. We're used to that number, but we're also told in Genesis 7 and 8 that the flood was 150 days, right? We're also told in one version of the story that Noah was told by God to bring onto the ark 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of animals that are unclean. And in the other version of the story, the 150-day one, Noah is told to bring male and female of all the animals on the earth. So these are just flat out different versions of the story, and they are smushed together in the book of Genesis for our reception. And to know that tells us some really important things about how we're supposed to be reading these stories. Clearly not as literal historical truth. First of all, if you had any doubt about that, not as modern history, and not as a history that you can sort of hear once and think right? There are too many things going on in the story for us to sort of take it in and get it. The truth is that when we enter into a mythical story like this, especially as modern readers, we have to bounce around between different kinds of truth, different ways of being told about God. And this involves different sources, different modes of storytelling, and we're going to explore that just a little bit more. I will blank my screen up for a moment while I share with you. So we are thinking mythically when we read the story of Noah and the flood. And this means, on one hand, we're thinking about the fact that there are two different sources for the story and that they are compacted together into one in the book of Genesis. We are also being asked to think about the way that this story of Noah's flood connects to other stories in the Hebrew scriptures. And most vividly, the story of the flood is connected to the story of the creation. So in Genesis 1 and verse 6, God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. And God called the dome sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment just to talk about that passage. You've got literally a mythic structure there. The idea in the ancient world of the way the cosmos were shaped, in which originally there is undifferentiated chaos, right, including waters running over everything. And God's act of creation is actually an act of separation, right? God separates out the waters, pushes some of them up into the heavens behind what's called the firmament. God creates a dome in the heavens and pushes the water up there. And in this ancient way of understanding, the waters that fall, at a time of year like this one, the rain and the snow, the waters are up there in a kind of vault up in the firmament, and those open and the water comes down. That's what rain is, right? And of course, if they were to really be open, there would be a terrible flood. Also, the waters are pushed down on the ground also. So the waters in the ground and the waters in the sky are separated out from one another. And then God does the further act of separating the waters from the dry land that are on the earth. And so God pushes the water apart and lets the dry land sort of emerge in this model. So it's a very definite gesture of separating things out, especially water, pushing water away, right, to bring the dry lands forward. What we see, I'll go back to the, what we see when we look at the way that the flood of Noah is described is that it starts to feel like the story of the creation is being run backwards, right? So God pushed all the waters apart to create dry space so that we could live. In Genesis 7, starting at verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. So the waters that had pushed down into the great fountains of the deep are springing up again, causing the oceans to rise. And the waters that are up in the heavens are coming down again. God is uncreating creation. So it's not just a flood. It's a very specifically biblical event that harkens back to the story of creation and says creation was being undone because of the evil of human life, right? Because humans were behaving badly. The flood continued in this version 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters swelled and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. The waters swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. And then we hear language that sounds a lot like God creating all the animals of the earth. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, domestic animals, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all human beings. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life. Listen back to that story about God breathing the breath of life into Adam and Eve, died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, human beings and animals and creeping things and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark, and the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days. So you hear the telling of that story. It's not simply a factual account. It's that kind of rich poetic language that really, really echoes the rich poetic language of Genesis 1, in which God is creating the cosmos out of chaos, right? That's a clue to us. It's a clue to us not only because this story echoes the story of creation in Genesis, but because it echoes another foundational mythological story for the Hebrew people, which is the crossing of the Red Sea. What does God do in the crossing of the Red Sea but part the waters, right? God has just a very distinctive gesture in relationship to water in the Old Testament. Parting waters is an act of creation, and allowing the waters to flow back together is an act of blotting out. And so God parts the waters and provides dry land for the Israelites to cross the Red Sea. And after they cross and the Egyptian army comes into the Red Sea onto that dry land to follow them, God closes the waters back up and kills the entire Egyptian army, right? let's pause for a moment to note that these are immensely violent stories, and we'll come back to that too, because obviously that's really important when we're talking about how to read the story of Noah and the flood. It's not an amusing story; it's a terrifying story, and in the age of global warming, it's a really terrifying story, right? So, what we hear, and Pete Enns is very good in The Bible Tells Me So at talking about this, what we hear is that there is a recognizable pattern of creation and uncreation that God controls. And those three big events of creation, the flood, and the Exodus are being lined up for us in the books of the Torah, in the old storytelling books of the Bible. Remember, they're being compiled sometime during the more consolidated monarchy and or exile in the history of the people of Israel. They're taking these ancient legends and lining them up to repeat and poetically elaborate upon the understanding that God, the God who creates Israel, is the God who creates everything and who has the power of the control over chaos, right? And the parting of the waters and the creation of the heavens and the creation of the earth. And the fact that God shows, sort of tips his, because, you know, this is patriarchal God here, that God tips his hand at these key moments in the history of Israel is a signal to the people of Israel and the people of Judah, the Hebrew people, that they are in God's care, and that the promised land, kind of in a really literal way, right? The parting out of water and the dry land is there for them because of God's work, and that it's all connected to their relationship to God. So their God being the creator is also connected to their God providing them land and creating them as a people. It's not clear when we look back over these stories that the story of Genesis, for instance, is really meant to be understood as the creation of all things in the kind of pseudoscientific way that modern Christians often want to insist it is. Certainly not telling us that literally everything was created in 6 or 7 days or through a process that can be detailed in the way that this story details for us. But it's possible that that story in the book of Genesis, really more than explaining how the whole earth got here, it's laying down the pattern that tells us that the God of Israel is the God of all creation, and that God's characteristic action is to build the cosmos out of chaos, right? To create dry land where there's only water, and also to destroy when God's logic is not being followed, when God's people are not being supported. This is a proto-nationalistic story. It's a story for the people of Israel, that their God is the God, and that their God kills their enemies, right? It's not a surprise that that's in the Bible. And yet every time we read the Bible, we need to come to terms with the fact that this is written in a culture of war. It's written in a culture of a struggle for survival. It is not meant to be laying down an ethical code at that level for us in modern life. We do not find permission to kill our enemies. We are not here to gloat over the destruction of other people, or we don't need to take from these stories some kind of ethic that says that I'll survive and you won't. Our salvation is not Noah's Ark. It's not a lifeboat, right, that other people are kicked off of. A word about that ark. Well, a couple of words about the ark. The first thing I'd like to say about it is that, again, Enns is quite good on this subject, Peter Enns, that the way the ark is constructed uses language that is echoed again when we hear about Moses being put in a basket that is rendered waterproof with sap and tar, right, and floated in the river and then picked up by the Pharaoh's daughter. It's a funny little moment, but Moses floating along in his little basket is another poetic analogy back to the story of Noah floating along in his ark. Those are stories of miraculous survival and rescue. They are not stories of pushing other people out of the boat, right? Okay, the story of Noah does that, right? It says, Noah and his wife and his family and everything else with the smell of life in its nostrils is wiped out, including the people. And the crossing of the Red Sea, of course, is about killing all of the Egyptians. Nothing about the way this story is told requires us to receive it as license for war or destruction, and nothing in it licenses us to continue the logic of competition that's woven into these texts, right? We'll come to that more when we, hopefully, when we talk about Jesus and the New Testament. We do read as Christians, but I want to say that it's also true in Judaism that to look back at these stories does not require the belief that God is only for Israel or that God is a violent God, right? We are allowed to take these stories as very old poetry, and we're allowed to consider the cultures that they come from. We're allowed to consider the ethic of war in that time, and we are enjoined to consider how much that godlike power is now in our own hands. We have the power to destroy with our weaponry, with our production of carbon, our exploitation of fossil fuels. We now are the ones with the power to blot out and destroy. That's where we need to be in the understanding of these stories, not harboring any lingering sense that because the Old Testament tells stories of massive destruction, that God is out to destroy, right? These are stories that tell the people of Israel that God is with them. And we're not bound by that understanding to any violence of any kind, nor are Jews, right? And that is a beautiful thing and reason enough, I think, to want to be smart about the Old Testament is just to make it very, very clear. We don't have to perform an act of the will. We don't have to ignore parts of these biblical stories. We simply need to accept that they are very, very ancient forms of storytelling that are about primal forces of creation and death, and that nothing in them requires or licenses us to behave like angry gods, nor is God angry, right? We are allowed to let go of that understanding. Another way to look at what's going on in the story of the flood of Noah is to realize that, again, according to Pete Enns here at the bottom of this page, many biblical scholars relying on geological findings, right? So not just reading these stories and thinking, oh, it probably refers to something, but relying on geological findings, they believe that a great deluge in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE might have been the trigger for the many flood stories that circulated in the ancient world. Some of them were already 2,000 years old by the time King David came on the scene. And then much later, as they're being compiled into the Hebrew scriptures, they are ancient stories. Remember that when a biblical story says God wiped out everything on the face of the earth, what they're really saying is there was a big flood, right? And God destroyed a lot in this big flood. But for them, the whole earth is the small area, right, around the Mesopotamia. So we don't, again, need to believe that God licenses the wiping out of the world, just in case you were worried about that. But the other thing that's going on here is to realize that the story of Noah, like the creation story, is directly related to other Mesopotamian stories of creation and of flooding. So Here is Genesis 8, starting at verse 6, just again, some description about the flood. This is as the waters are receding when Noah hits dry land, right? At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent out the raven, and it went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent out the dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground, but the dove found no place to set its foot, and it returned to him in the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took it and brought it back, the dove, into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent out the dove from the ark, and the dove came back to him in the evening, and there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent out the dove, and it did not return to him anymore because it was vacationing on dry land somewhere and didn't need to return to the ark. All right, so that is, again, you can hear the poetry of it, the 7 days, this bird, that bird, the image of the olive branch that we talk about as a peace offering comes from this story. It's a beautiful little detachable part of the story that actually echoes almost point for point a story in, for instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is quoted in Luke Timothy Johnson's book on the Old Testament. When the seventh day, this is Ushnapatim talking about what happened after his boat hit dry land after the big flood that he was in. When the seventh day arrived, I put out and released a dove. The dove went, it came back, for no perching place was visible to it, and it turned round. I put out and released a swallow. The swallow went, it came back, for no perching place was visible to it, and it turned round. I put out and released a raven. The raven went and saw the waters receding, and it ate, preened, lifted its tail, and did not turn round. Then I put everything out to the four winds, and I made a sacrifice. Right. So there is another ancient Mesopotamian story that sounds almost exactly like part of what's in the story of Noah's flood, which tells us more stuff about what's happening when you think mythically. Not only do we have this sort of like, should we say, longitudinal continuity, right? There's the creation story, the flood story, the Exodus story, and other stories later that all have the same language about God creating the waters and the deep and the firmament. But we also have what I want to say is like more like a horizontal sort of story, latitudinal, I guess, of the story of the one and only creation God sounding extremely close to the gods of the neighboring nations. And at times there are variations in the way the story is told. This is a whole field of study that you can get into if you want to, about what the Hebrew people were doing when they told this story in the way that they told it. The short answer is that they were really eager to emphasize in the creation story that the heavens and the earth and the stars and the sun, et cetera, are controlled by God. They are not gods in their own right, right? That's a very important focus in the Hebrew telling of the story. Here, the story of the flood, again, is very specifically being tailored to correspond to the story of the founding of the people of Israel. Ushnapatim putting out a sacrifice is also echoed very carefully in what Noah does. Noah burns a sacrifice to God, and God smells the fragrance and is pleased. The same thing happens here. The sacrifice is burned, and the scent of it goes into the nose of the gods, plural, and they swarm around it like flies. Right? So the monotheism of the story is really important, but so are two things, right? Two other things are recorded here. Probably a memory of a big flood in the area that permeated a bunch of stories for the local peoples. Makes perfect sense. That's how history is recorded in ancient times, right? In story. And also the sense that the Hebrew scriptures are echoing and in many ways revising the stories of their neighbors. also, the stories of their neighbors become the stories that are that belong to the people who hold them in captivity, the Babylonians, for instance. And so using these stories now is one-upping the culture that holds them captive, which is also a really important thing to remember. So what is thinking mythically, right? What are we doing when we think mythically? What I want to say most importantly is that there isn't one single answer to that question. When we enter into mythical space, we're entering into a space of storytelling. Poetic is sort of the best word I can use for it, except that it's less of a sort of single act of poetic brilliance. Like, these aren't the poems of John Donne, right? These are the poems of people. They're not written with a sense of individual ownership or self-expression. They're written as records of important cultural understandings and important cultural events and important geological events even. They're also written to shape the people, right? They're used to shape the people. And when they are being written down as the Hebrew scriptures, that's a compendium then of ancient oral stories, some of which record actual geological events, probably, also talk about the relationship between Israel and its neighbors and the way that Israel's mythic consciousness and understanding of God is not the same as the neighbors, even when they borrow or come from the same sources and use some of the same language. Then there's the patterning of the creation story of the separation of the waters that's meant to remind the people of Israel that at all the key points, way back to the beginning of everything for them, there's that same God who gets them ultimately across the Jordan River and into the Promised Land. That's another place where those stories of parting water come up. So history, geology, politics, spirituality, though perhaps not quite in the form that we would recognize it, morale, right? Or a sort of coherence of a community that is going through very, very difficult experiences, including the loss of the land that God made for them, right? All of these things are being brought to life in the stories of the people of Israel. And when we read these stories, the last thing we need to do is tell ourselves that they bind us in some sort of modern way to a factual understanding of what's being told there. And I just, again, want to say, you please feel free to take the liberty not to bring the violence of these stories forward. It doesn't need to be brought forward any more than we need to bring forward the understanding that God parts waters and puts a dome up in the heaven, right? That's architecture from an ancient culture. And the fact that we're still competitive and still nationalistic and still violent is not because it's the will of God, right? These stories are not whispered by God into the ear of Moses, who writes them down, right? They are clearly formed through a very, very complex process. And as you know, bizarrely, here we are in the 21st century reading these stories facing flood, right? We're in this period of global warming where the waters are rising. This language is incredibly resonant for us. It's extremely important, actually, that we learn how to go back to these stories and take from them what we need for this moment, what God is calling us to take from these stories in this moment. But don't be afraid. You are not bound to the understanding that God can't wait to wipe us out. That's not right. That is not right. And even, how should I put this? Even in those stories, right, that power belongs to God. It doesn't belong to humanity. But these stories record the baffling experience of living in a world in which massive destruction does happen, right? There were floods. That's still a huge theological problem, isn't it? And the scriptures don't answer that problem. They don't tell us why there was a flood. We're not required to believe that God is angry at us. We are not required to take in ancient Babylonian storytelling about a flood in order to explain good and evil in the present moment. But we are invited into a world in which multiple systems of storytelling and multiple forms of storytelling all bounce up against one another. And we're free in that world, right? We're free. And we've agreed in the church to follow the orientation of the church through these scriptures, not to be limited by them, but also not to run away from them in fear. And so if this kind of hectic reporting on the multiple forms of storytelling in the Hebrew scriptures does anything for you, I hope it gives you a sense of empowerment as readers of the scriptures to take what God needs us to take from the story and to leave what we know we are meant to leave behind. And we're meant to leave that violence behind. Violence is not a Jewish thing. I want to hasten to say that this is not an anti-Semitic reading of these stories. This is a reading of all scripture, all the way up to, through the book of Revelation, that is not bound by violent imagery in storytelling, and that is instead bound to the ethic of love that we learn in the Hebrew scriptures and we learn in the Christian scriptures. More on that as we study the Christian scriptures, but that's a nutshell version. Thanks.